Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Virtual Training Institute. If you are just entering the Zoom room, please go ahead and use the chat box to type in your name and the program that you're joining us from this morning. We have 22 of you. Morning, Grayla. Morning, Doug. Morning, Sue. Okay, we are rolling in now. Welcome, everyone. Okay, so we can get an idea of who's in the room with us today. There is a poll up on your, well, now there's a poll up on your screen. If you can just take a minute and tell us what role you have within your program. If it's more than one, just feel free to click more than one. Okay, we have a lot of instructional specialists with us. Quite a few ABE and ESL instructors. Great. Okay, so you can see the results on the screen. The largest component we have today is the ABE instructors, which is a perfect audience for Ramona's presentation. So Ramona, if you're ready, I'm going to turn it over to you so you can do a brief introduction and get us started.
Great, thank you, Ellen. So just a little bit about me is I taught for about 30 years in ABE and GED instruction. So what I'm going to present today actually comes from one of the classes that I taught when I taught what we called a comp math class at CCBC. And it was a class that was specifically designed for those students who had a fairly high reading score on their CASAS, but it was evident that they needed to bring up their math skills. So we want to work with them on their math skills so that their math and their reading were a little bit more on the same level, and they could move a little bit, I guess you could say, effortlessly into a GED class. So the other, I guess I'll say the other thinking behind this is many of our programs have multi-level classes. And it's always, I found that it was nice to find some activity in which it would bring the class together in some way. And so this is a way in which you can use the same materials, but you can use it for different levels so that students sort of feel like that they're part of the class in general, and everybody's doing something that's at least a little bit related. So when I taught this class, it was really specifically geared for those who were working on fractions, decimals, and percents, and ratios and proportions. But as I started to create this PowerPoint, I started to think beyond that, so that if you truly have what we used to call a one-room schoolhouse, you can incorporate all sorts of different levels. So, so here are some of the things that I'm going to talk about this morning. Oh, and first of all, let me first extend a heartfelt thanks for all of you that are joining today and taking time away from your busy schedules. I know that this is a busy time for programs as you're wrapping up your semester, so thank you. So we're going to talk a little bit about patterns, whole number operations, fractions, word problems, ratios and proportions, percents, probability, and measures of central tendency. So here's some things that I found on the internet, just trying to gather up things. So you can start really early on with just talking about patterns. So they can see the different M&Ms, and they could use actual M&Ms to then place on the circle what would be next in the pattern. Another thing that I found was adding and subtracting just within 20. And I'm going to tell you, I'm not real crazy about the design of this worksheet, but you can change it to whatever you want to. The way they design this is that you have these like different squares, and you would show 5 red M&Ms, and then you would use 12 M&Ms. I'm not 100% certain why they blocked it out the way that they did, but again, you can just go ahead and redesign this in a way that might make a little bit more sense. And then what I do like about this is that underneath they then have an equation so that they can see the connection between the word problem and then taking that word problem and actually creating an equation, because as they move along through their steps, they're going to have to be able to take something like this and create an equation. This is just something else that I found on the internet just to show the concept of multiplication. I think sometimes they don't really understand how that really looks in real life. You know, just memorizing a multiplication fact is great to a point, but we want them to understand what that really means. Here's something else that I found with division. So they can actually, you can see on the right-hand side, it says, I think that should say model your M&M group. So again, they can take that concept and they can show with M&Ms what that really looks like conceptually. One of the things that I did when I taught math, and I'll say that actually teaching math was my favorite subject to teach, and students always struggle with word problems. And at a certain point, after we did enough word problems, I actually had students write their own word problems. You might want to have them start off, I would actually have them start off by doing it either in a small group or in pairs, just so that they could help each other. But what I liked about having students write their own word problems is it really got them to think conceptually about what goes into creating a word problem and thinking through that entire process. Once they had some practice, I also encouraged them to include unnecessary information, because as we know, word problems do include information that isn't essential to figuring out the answer. And then what they would do, once they wrote their word problems, I would have them exchange their word problems with another student or pair of students or even a small group, and then they would have to work through that word problem that another group created. However, I will say that I found students will create word problems that are way more complicated or difficult than what they would ever see in one of their number power books or anything that I would have ever created myself. So I sometimes had to encourage students to not make it so overly difficult and challenging that it would just kind of always make your head explode. So when I taught the class that I'm referring to, this comp math class, I use this as a review activity because, as we know, as students work through each individual concept, they're okay in the moment, but then when you have to bring it all together and review those concepts, sometimes it gets a little lost. So I wanted to come up with some way of bringing it all together that would be fun for them. So I used M&Ms, and what I did is I brought in paper plates so that they could work with it on a paper plate or on a paper towel, and then they could actually eat the M&Ms at the end, and who doesn't love that? So here are some things that I had them do. So what I had them do is, oh, I'm sorry. Let me back up. This is just some other things that I found on the internet of ways that they can work with fractions. This is another thing that I found, just a graphic, so that they actually write the fraction for each color. And then they even combine it by combining like red and blue or orange and brown, and so on and so forth, and just other questions that they can come up with to work with M&Ms when they're working with fractions. Even creating a graph. So here's one that's not filled in, and they could actually take their M&Ms and place them in each one of these squares if they're a lower level student, or they could actually then take that graph and use maybe like a colored pencil or a marker to shade in the number of cells that would then represent the number of M&Ms of that color that's in their packet. I use the like the little, I guess they call it the fun size packets. That tends to work better. So when I did this, you can use either M&Ms or you can use Skittles, even poker chips if you find ones that are of different colors, or marbles. Marbles are a little bit more difficult just because they roll around, but you can do that if you don't want to have to keep buying more and more M&Ms or Skittles every time you do this activity. So when I did this activity, I had them, I gave them the choice. They could either work independently or they can work in pairs. And most students want to work in pairs, but there were some that chose to actually just do it on their own. So what I did is, like I said, I used a paper plate so that the students could then eat the candy when they were finished. And they really seemed to enjoy that. So the way I did this is I had them first write down the number of each color of M&Ms in their packet. It just made it much easier as they worked through each one of the steps, because again, this was a review. So they were doing lots of different skills within this one activity. So started with ratio and proportions, and just here's an example. So they determine the ratios of one given color to another. So for example, they would have the number of green M&Ms to the number of yellow. And then to add in proportions, it was, okay, let's just suppose you have 80 green M&Ms. Based on the ratio in your packet, how many yellow M&Ms would you then have? And this was also a nice way to bring in rounding, because then a lot of times it wouldn't always work out perfectly. They could then round their answer to determine how many yellow M&Ms they would then have. Did the same thing with percents. Again, this is pretty straightforward. Just figure out the percent of each color of M&Ms in their packet. Probability. I included independent probability and also dependent probability. So independent probability means you're figuring out the probability of picking a certain color, but you're returning the M&M back to your pile. With dependent probability, you're taking out that M&M, but you're not returning it to the pile. So then based on taking out that M&M, you then have to figure out the probability of another color of picking that M&M, but based on a new set of situation based on having removed the M&M from the prior step. Measures of central tendency. This actually I found to be probably the most interesting part of this activity. And I'll show you what I mean in the next slide. So what I did is on the board, I wrote each student that was in the class. And when I did this activity, there were about 10 students. And then I wrote the color up above. And I'll show you what I mean by that right here. So this is just a chart, and you can actually even create this and then give your students this chart if you want them to have an example. So once we had, going back to this, each number of M&Ms was indicated on the whiteboard for each student. And now once we did that, each student either could independently, or you can do it as a class, you know, based on what you feel is their comfort level, is you can have them actually calculate the mean, median, mode, and range. What I did is I used the internet to find out what the M&M company said was the average. And then we use that to compare the class results with the company's results. So just so you know, this is, I looked this up, and this is the latest that I could find for the average for each color. And it was just interesting to see how the classes average compared with the M&M company. Here's for Skittles, and interestingly, they're pretty evenly across the board for each of the 5 colors. So that's how I did it. And again, I just want to emphasize that really my goal for this was to come up with different activities in which everybody is using M&Ms, so that, again, everybody feels like they're being part of a group. It takes a fair amount of coordination and I guess I'll say preparation ahead of time, but I gotta tell you, my students really, really enjoyed it, and it was just a nice way for them to be able to manipulate materials to reinforce those concepts. I like it, I guess maybe partly because I'm very much a tactile kinesthetic learner, and I like moving things around and manipulating things. That's how I learn best. So I want those students who are tactile kinesthetic learners to have the opportunity to move, to manipulate things, again, just to reinforce that. And it was just a nice way to have a review of all those concepts that they had learned up until that point. So it looks like I'm getting pretty close to the end of my time.
Yes, thank you so much, Ramona. Wonderful clarification. You'll have to remind us what central tendency means for some of us who need a reminder, but thank you so much. So participants, thank you for attending this morning. There is a feedback survey in the chat box. That's a very short survey. If you can give us some feedback, we would love that. Also, all recordings and handouts will be available on the website that Gina created. I'm going to paste that link into the chat box as well. So all of those will be uploaded within the next week or so. So thank you so much, Ramona. Thank you for those of you who are braving the cold winter weather to be with us virtually this morning. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.